So I'd like to be able to debunk a few things about Joe Burrow's meteoric rise at LSU. A lot of things said, written about him. Everybody is going to be seeing him in the Super Bowl. Maybe if you're watching this after the Super Bowl, you've already seen Joe Burrow. But I want to just kind of get ahead of a few things that have been thrown out there because, there have been some things that are maybe a little bit of an exaggeration of the truth. One of the things I've heard or seen thrown out there is, oh, he was this guy who wasn't really wanted as a recruit. That's just not necessarily true. Joe Burrow was a four-star recruit. He, of course, did the Ohio State offer. I think people will oftentimes look at maybe, oh, this was a guy early on in his high school career who didn't have a ton of big-time offers. That's absolutely true. Joe Burrow had one offer after his junior year, and it was from his dad's school, Ohio University. And I've seen, like Kirk Herbstreit said during the 2019 national championship, that Joe Burrow was a two-star recruit. And it's just like, well, that's not necessarily the case. It doesn't mean he was like some decorated blue chip guy, but at the same time, I think we need to be able to kind of keep that into perspective. He was extremely prolific in high school, Gatorade Player of the Year, the whole deal. Like he was a guy who had over 11,000 passing yards during his career. He did not get the Elite 11 national invites as a member of that 2015 class. Lamar Jackson also did not get that national invite, get the regional invite, not necessarily the national invite. So just want to make sure that that's known, that Joe Burrow was a very good recruit, maybe not an elite recruit, not a top 5 quarterback in the country, but definitely somebody who was highly regarded. You have to be to get a scholarship offer from the Ohio State. Speaking of Ohio State, Joe Burrow was behind Dwayne Haskins on the depth chart, not Tate, or as many have come to know him as Tathan Martell. Let's also have the context there, because Joe Burrow got hurt 2017, practice right before the start of the season. He's getting ready to be JT Barrett's backup. JT Barrett, who had been in Ohio State for like 15,000 years. Joe Burrow is seemingly going to step into that role in his, and step into that role and be a backup in what would be his third season of college football. And instead, in practice, hits his hand on a lineman's helmet, and then he's out. And then Dwayne Haskins takes the role of backup. And if you recall, Dwayne Haskins stepped in for JT Barrett in that Michigan game, looked really, really good. And you can't help but think that played an impact on him having a little bit of a leg up going into that offseason starting in 2018, where they had this battle in spring camp. Did not include Tate Martell. It was a battle between those two guys. And there are a lot of people who will say, Ohio State didn't want him. Colin Cowherd has said that before. Ohio State got rid of Joe Burrow. Let's call it what it is. That's just not the case at all. And anybody that remembers that time remembers that it felt like a true battle, but because of what we saw from Dwayne Haskins in 2017, somebody that Urban Meyer said was the best quarterback recruit he had ever seen. Like some of the things that Urban was saying about Haskins back in the day was pretty crazy if you go back and look at some of that stuff. But it was also very well known within that Ohio State locker room that Joe Burrow was a dude, like a real dude. I mean, I remember going to Big Ten Media Days and asking, all right, I wanted to ask Ohio State players. I asked Urban Meyer, basically like, what was LSU getting in Joe Burrow? And you go back to some of these comments and it's just like, oh my God, like the word leader gets thrown around. It's a bit of a cliche thing, but you'd see like Paris Campbell said he was a true warrior. Draymond Jones, who was his college roommate, was like, he's a leader. He's going to take over that huddle. Believe me when I say this, like he's a different kind of dude. And I remember Urban Meyer saying that he was a made player, which is an interesting way to come up with a description for a guy who just left your team, like a made player, as in you developed him. And Urban obviously would love to be able to take credit for his development. Joe Burrow was a very good player 2018 when he left and was deciding between Cincinnati and LSU. And ultimately it was LSU who decided that Joe Burrow had potential to be the starter, and the rest is kind of history there. Another thing that we should probably debunk: don't play the results of the NFL with the Dwayne Haskins, Joe Burrow thing. There are a lot of people doing that. Oh my God, I can't believe Ohio State chose Dwayne Haskins over Joe Burrow. Dwayne Haskins was a much better football player in 2018 than Joe Burrow was. Like, Dwayne Haskins is out here breaking Drew Brees' records in 2018. Yeah. Was he maybe not equipped to go to the NFL and have success? Did he have some issues that prevented him from being able to do so? Of course. But just because Ohio State said that Dwayne Haskins was their guy in 2018, which actually, by the way, they didn't even come out and say that. So I should probably debunk myself before we even go down that road. It should be known that Dwayne Haskins was an unreal college player. I mean, went to New York for the Heisman ceremony. Meanwhile, Joe Burrow was at LSU where he had 16 touchdown passes. Let's also debunk that. Joe Burrow was way better than what his numbers indicated in 2018. If you kind of look back at that season, you realize a few things. One is that LSU had no quarterback depth whatsoever. They had two guys transfer basically after Burrow arrived, and Ed Orgeron's like, oh, I'm going to make him kind of my guy. I feel like I need to go out on a limb and make him the leader of this team, when he was, of course, on the hot seat. And then Miles Brennan was the backup. Miles Brennan was hurt for most of the year. So Steve Ensminger, the offensive coordinator, was strapped. There's only so much you can do. And with a bad offensive line, which LSU had, they really didn't have a whole lot of room for error. They couldn't run Joe Burrow up until the very end of the season. And they finally started running him at the end of the year in that game against Texas A&M. Now, I'll get to that more on that in a second here, but I think what needs to be debunked is this belief that Joe Burrow was like a bad player in 2018. He was really, really good. And he had moments against elite defenses in which he looked the part. He faced 6 top 20 defenses that year, a ton. And LSU, all they did was go to a New Year's Six Bowl and win for the first time in the playoff era. And they would not have done that without Joe Burrow. Yeah, they had a really good defense led by a certain Devin White, but Joe Burrow was an excellent player, despite the fact that he went an entire month without a touchdown pass. He wasn't getting the numbers. There was only so much that they could do with him. And obviously that offensive system was a bit limited. And Joe Burrow came in over the summer and decided, all right, I got to figure out this offense in a hurry against a really difficult schedule. He was able to get LSU to double-digit wins that season. All right, I said I was going to come back to the A&M game. That, in my opinion, is like when Joe Burrow took this next step. You're seeing a lot of pictures about the hit against UCF. It was a cheap shot in the bowl game, in the Fiesta Bowl, where all of a sudden, like, you're thinking to yourself, man, is LSU going to lose this game? They're down 14-3. And it looks like, Joe Burrow is, he's a guy. He's a solid player, but he's not necessarily the guy that's going to take them to that next level. I would actually argue that we saw shades of him being more than a guy in that A&M game. And then during certain points during the regular season, like what we saw in that dime that he threw in the fourth quarter against Auburn to be able to rally back and win at Jordan-Hare, kind of even what we saw, some of the throws he was making in that opener against that really good Miami defense that didn't turn out to be as good as we thought. But I just thought there were moments there. And then the A&M game really was what did it for me, where he just decides 7 overtime game, I'm going to try and put this entire team on my back. And depending on who you ask about some of those calls down the stretch, that game easily could have gone in LSU's favor. And if you recall, Ed Orgeron had a very nice sticky Gatorade bath because LSU thought that game was going in its favor. But I thought Joe Burrow was magnificent. He was so freaking good on that night. And the number of times that he could call his own number, because, hey, when you have a month to rest, you don't necessarily need to worry about your backup quarterback situation. You can kind of turn him loose. And that's really what LSU did in that game. So I think, it's kind of a fun storyline to be able to say, he rose from the dead after the UCF cheap shot, and he was able to turn into this guy who never lost in college again. And then he became the player he became. I think we saw shades of that when he was finally unleashed against A&M. One other thing that I think is worth debunking, he has the whole Nebraska thing, right? Like, the Nebraska thing that's made the rounds. Scott Frost, you think he's better than what we got? Joe Burrow wanted to go to Nebraska out of high school, didn't have that offer. And then when he was a transfer 2018, Scott Frost essentially said, freshman Adrian Martinez is better than Joe Burrow, foot in mouth, the comment that came out. If you actually kind of look back, Paul Meyerberg had a tweet about this, about how if you listen to what Scott Frost said about asking that question, you think he's better than what we got? He legitimately didn't know. He wasn't asking that question to come off as a guy who was arrogant about the situation. Obviously, results didn't help him, but he was more curious about it. He truly did not know what kind of player Joe Burrow was. He wasn't on that staff that would have been responsible for recruiting Joe Burrow out of high school. So a little bit different there. But Nebraska's the one that's going to take it on the chin. And if you search Nebraska Burrow during the Super Bowl, it's gonna look really, really bad. It pretty much does every time Joe Burrow does anything worth I don't know, like anything that makes national headlines or anything like that. Nebraska always has to take it on the chin. They should probably take some blame, but maybe not quite as much blame as what they ultimately take from a lot of different people. The fact that they've had such bad quarterback play, certainly a part of that. But one last thing. I think Joe Burrow unlocked what he became because of the system that he was able to play in with Joe Brady after he came from the New Orleans Saints, and being able to play with really good receivers around him, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, just to name a few. And I don't necessarily know that Joe Burrow turns into Joe Burrow if two things happen. One, if he stayed at Ohio State and if he had to run the Urban Meyer offense instead of the Ryan Day offense. Now, he would have eventually, you would think, been able to run the Ryan Day offense, but if he had just played in the offense that he was recruited to run, I don't think he would have taken off and been this unbelievable NFL prospect, Heisman Trophy winner, all these different things. Other thing, if he had stayed at LSU, I think he would have been potentially an all-conference quarterback in 2019, running that same system with Steve Ensminger. But when they incorporated the spread principles, obviously everybody knows that's when Joe Burrow took off, and understandably so. You look at the weapons around him and the way that they're able to utilize him. But I do think it's worth at least acknowledging that Joe Burrow still would have been an awesome quarterback in 2019. And he had great receivers around him. I had so many guys coming back. Foster Moreau was the only guy drafted from that offense in 2019, meaning from the 2018 roster. So they had all those guys. Jamar Chase was coming on. Justin Jefferson really started to emerge as a go-to guy in 2018. Thad Moss became a thing in 2019, like Clyde Edwards-Helaire. They had an offensive line that was returning so many different dudes, and they were going to be healthy. So Joe Burrow was going to get better in 2019. Like, he was inevitably going to get better. He wouldn't have been the number one overall pick if not for Joe Brady coming in and implementing that system. But at the same time, I just think that's worth remembering. So hopefully you learned a few things about Joe Burrow and his very, very meteoric rise to where he is right now.